Welcome to Crime Drama TV. Please note, the stories we share are works of fiction inspired by real-life events. To protect the privacy of those involved, all names and details have been altered. Now, sit back and enjoy the drama.
A House of Cards. The storm rattled the windows of the modest Caldwell home in Flint, Michigan, as Naomi sat hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table. The glow of the screen illuminated her tense face, her eyes locked on the spreadsheet displayed in front of her. A $300 charge at a downtown hotel glared at her like an unspoken confession. Her breath hitched as she scrolled further, uncovering more troubling entries. Gas station charges from unfamiliar locations, frequent ATM withdrawals, and a new credit card account she hadn't opened. The numbers blurred as anger and dread churned in her chest. She closed the laptop with a sharp snap, her knuckles white against the edge of the table. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her, but Naomi barely noticed. She turned sharply as Tasha walked into the kitchen, her laughter light and carefree.
Everything okay?
Tasha asked, setting her mug on the counter. Her tone was easy, as though the world wasn't crashing down around them.
Just going over bills,
Naomi said quickly, forcing a smile. Her voice was tight, but Tasha didn't seem to notice. She hummed lightly as she poured herself a cup of tea, her movements unhurried and confident. Tasha had moved in 2 months ago, freshly single and looking for a new start after a messy breakup. Dante had been the one to insist they help her out, and Naomi had agreed, though reluctantly.
Family comes first,
Dante had said, his smile disarming as always. And Naomi had tried to believe him. But lately, things felt off. Dante's charm had always been his strongest weapon. As a senior patrol officer in Flint, he could disarm even the toughest skeptics with a grin. That same charm had swept Naomi off her feet years ago, and it still had the power to unsettle her now, especially late at night, when she found him whispering into his phone.
Work,
He'd say, flashing that familiar grin. But Naomi wasn't sure if she believed him anymore. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the house as Naomi rinsed her mug in the sink. Behind her, Tasha's laughter echoed from the living room, mingling with the sound of a commercial on the TV. Naomi's grip tightened on the counter as she stared into the darkness beyond the window. She'd agreed to help Tasha because Dante had asked, but now she wondered if she'd let a wolf into her home. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one building inside her. Cracks in the facade. Rain lashed against the windows as Naomi stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes a testament to sleepless nights. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. At work, she could mask the cracks, focusing on her patients. At home, the facade was impossible to maintain. From the kitchen, Tasha's humming drifted through the house, cheerful and unaffected. Naomi's jaw tightened. The sound didn't match the storm raging inside her. She entered the kitchen to find Tasha seated at the table, surrounded by a stack of lesson plans. Tasha looked up, her smile warm and easy.
Morning. This rain's really coming down, huh?
Naomi poured herself a mug of coffee, her movements stiff.
nonstop.
She muttered. Tasha chuckled.
I've got a field trip next week. First one here. The kids are so excited.
That's nice.
Naomi replied flatly, the bitterness of her coffee matching the knot in her stomach. Tasha's tone softened.
You and Dante have been amazing, letting me stay here after everything. I can't thank you enough.
Naomi forced a thin smile but said nothing. The words should have felt sincere, but they didn't. Was Tasha grateful, or playing a game Naomi didn't know the rules to? Later that afternoon, the house was eerily quiet for the first time in weeks. Naomi hesitated in the living room, her gaze landing on Tasha's purse sitting on the coffee table. Her pulse quickened. Don't do this, she told herself. You're being paranoid. But her hands moved on their own, trembling as they rifled through the bag. A faint waft of floral perfume, A scent Naomi never wore, rose from within. She pushed aside receipts and a tube of lipstick until her fingers brushed paper. A folded note. Her breath hitched as she unfolded it, the ink smudged but unmistakable.
I can't stop thinking about you. Same place tonight. D.
The room tilted around her. She sank onto the couch, clutching the note as her vision blurred. The signature was unmistakable. D. Dante. The front door creaked open, startling her. Naomi shoved the note back into the purse just as Tasha entered, her hair damp from the rain and her smile as radiant as ever.
Hey,
Tasha said lightly, slipping off her coat.
everything okay?
Naomi forced her lips into a smile. Her voice was unnervingly steady.
Yeah. Just thinking about dinner plans.
Inside, the storm had already broken. Shadows of the past. Naomi sat in the dimly lit living room, her gaze fixed on a wedding photo perched on the mantel. She and Dante beamed at the camera, their faces full of hope and promise. Her fingers brushed over the frame, tracing the edges of their frozen smiles. The vows they had exchanged that day echoed faintly in her mind, the word forever now feeling like a cruel joke. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of Tasha's footsteps upstairs. Naomi sighed, her chest heavy with a mix of suspicion and guilt. She wanted to believe that she was imagining things, that the late-night whispers and lingering glances were nothing. But the seed of doubt had taken root, and it grew stronger with every passing day. Upstairs, Tasha sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through her phone. Her fingers hovered over a message from Dante, her breath catching in her throat. A diner receipt sat on the nightstand beside her, its edges crinkled and worn from constant handling. She glanced at it, guilt stabbing at her chest. How had things come to this? The hum of her phone broke the silence. Naomi's voice called from downstairs, sharp but laced with concern.
Dinner's ready.
Tasha sighed and set her phone aside, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Dante's attention had once felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the depths of her post-breakup despair. Now it felt like a chain, dragging her into a storm she couldn't escape. At dinner, the tension was palpable. Naomi's fork scraped against her plate as she forced a tight smile.
How's the field trip planning going, Tasha?
She asked, her tone carefully neutral.
Oh, it's coming along.
Tasha replied, her voice overly bright. She focused on her plate, avoiding Naomi's eyes. Dante chimed in, his tone far too casual.
She's doing a great job. The kids love her.
Naomi's chest tightened as she watched them, her suspicions bubbling just beneath the surface. The laughter they shared felt too easy, too familiar. She pushed her chair back abruptly, standing with a forced smile.
Excuse me. I need to check on something.
Behind the closed door of their bedroom, Naomi's hands trembled as she unlocked Dante's phone. Her heart raced as she scrolled through his messages, each one a fresh wound. Familiar suspicions solidified into undeniable truths. Her breath hitched as she stared at a message from Dante. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. Naomi's vision blurred with tears as she stared at the words, her world splintering apart. Fault lines. The storm outside rattled the windows as Naomi paced the length of the bedroom, her mind racing. Her father's words echoed in her mind, sharp and unwelcome. That boy's solid. You keep him close. She clenched her fists, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What would her father say now? Would he still think Dante was solid, or would he see the cracks that had been there all along? She wiped at her eyes, her anger and heartbreak clashing in a chaotic storm. Downstairs, she could hear the faint murmur of Dante's voice. The warmth that once filled his tone now felt like a cruel mockery. Steeling herself, Naomi descended the stairs. Dante looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral.
Hey,
he said, his tone too casual.
everything okay?
Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line.
Fine.
She replied tightly, sitting across from him. Her gaze flicked to his phone on the table, its screen dark but taunting.
What were you talking about earlier?
Dante's brow furrowed slightly.
What do you mean?
You and Tasha.
Naomi said, her voice steady but cold.
I heard you earlier. What were you talking about?
Tasha froze mid-step as she entered the room, her face pale.
Oh, we were just...
Field trip stuff.
Dante interjected smoothly, his smile disarming.
She was asking for advice on managing the kids.
Naomi's eyes narrowed. Her gut screamed that he was lying, but the moment slipped away before she could seize it. Instead, she nodded stiffly.
Right.
The rest of the evening passed in strained silence, the storm outside a fitting backdrop to the tension within. Later, as Dante slept, Naomi sat in the darkened living room, her father's words still haunting her. She picked up her car keys, turning them over in her hand, her thumb brushing the jagged edges as if drawing strength. She closed her eyes, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would drive herself after him. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes. Tasha's dilemma. Tasha sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the diner receipt in her hand. The edges were worn, folded, and unfolded so many times that the ink had started to smudge. It whispered of choices she couldn't take back. She remembered the soft glow of the diner lights, Dante's easy smile, and the way her hand had lingered near his across the table. What had seemed harmless then now felt like a weight she couldn't bear. The rain outside grew heavier, its rhythm tapping against the glass like a countdown. Naomi's voice echoed in Tasha's mind.
We're family, Tasha. We'll get through anything together.
The thought twisted her stomach. Naomi had given her everything. A home, a fresh start, unconditional kindness. And this was how she repaid her? Tasha's grip on the receipt tightened, the paper crinkling loudly.
I have to end this,
She muttered, her voice trembling. But even as the words left her lips, doubt crept in. Would Dante let her walk away? Could she face Naomi knowing what she'd done? Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. A message from Dante lit up the screen. Tonight, same place. Her breath hitched. She set the receipt down, her resolve flickering like a candle in the wind. With shaking hands, she stood and grabbed her coat. As she slipped it on, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back looked like a stranger. Her chest tightened as she whispered to herself.
It ends tonight.
Tasha crumpled the receipt into her pocket, her movements stiff. Outside, the storm raged on, the sound of rain masking the faint hum of Naomi's car parked down the street, its headlights off, watching. The storm breaks. The evidence had been undeniable. Naomi's hands had trembled as she scrolled through Dante's messages earlier that evening, each one a dagger to her chest. She hadn't needed to read them twice. The decision to follow him had been instant, her fury a wildfire she couldn't contain. Now, rain lashed against the windshield as she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. Her father's words echoed faintly in her mind. That boy's solid. You keep him close. But those words felt like a cruel joke now, a hollow refrain in a world that had splintered apart. With trembling hands, she reached into the glove compartment. Her fingers hovered over the cold metal of the gun, her breath hitching as she closed her eyes. What was she doing? Was this the solution, or just another fracture in an already broken life? The storm outside felt like a reflection of the turmoil within, but as the thought of Tasha and Dante together flashed through her mind, her resolve hardened. With a sharp intake of breath, she grasped the gun and stepped into the rain. The motel's flickering neon sign cast jagged shadows across the parking lot, mirroring the chaos in her mind. She watched as Dante's car pulled in, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes later, another car arrived. Tasha stepped out, clutching her coat against the downpour. Naomi's vision blurred with tears. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought possible. The rain soaked through her coat as she approached the motel. Each step felt deliberate, her shoes squelching against the pavement. She hesitated outside the door, her pulse racing. Hotel doors locked automatically, but she'd watched Tasha hesitate as she entered, leaving it slightly ajar. Naomi reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. Inside, the room fell silent. Dante stood near the bed, his jacket half off, his eyes wide with shock. Tasha froze on the edge of the mattress, her face pale and stricken.
Naomi?
Dante's voice cracked, his hands raising in a defensive gesture.
What are you doing here?
Naomi's gaze flicked between them, her chest heaving. The gun in her hand felt like an anchor, pulling her deeper into darkness.
How could you?
She whispered, her voice breaking.
How could you both do this to me?
Dante took a cautious step forward.
Naomi, wait.
Don't you dare!
She snapped, her voice sharp. She turned to Tasha, tears streaming down her cousin's face.
You were supposed to be family. How long has this been going on?
Tasha's lips quivered.
I'm sorry, and
She stammered.
I didn't mean for it to.
Don't lie to me!
Naomi screamed, the storm outside echoing her fury. The room was a cacophony of emotions. Dante's pleading, Tasha's sobbing, and Naomi's ragged breaths. The gun wavered in her grip, her finger hovering over the trigger as the weight of the betrayal threatened to crush her. A flash of lightning illuminated the room as Naomi's hand steadied. 1 second, one choice, and then the storm inside her broke. Aftermath of the gunshot. The gunshot reverberated through the motel room, a deafening crack that left Naomi's ears ringing. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the damp air, clinging to her skin. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then Tasha collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor as a dark crimson stain spread across her chest. Naomi's hands trembled violently, the cold weight of the gun slipping from her grip and clattering onto the linoleum. Her knees buckled, and she sank beside Tasha, pressing her hands against the wound. The blood was warm and slick, seeping between her fingers as she cried out, her voice cracking.
Stay with me, Tasha. Please, stay with me.
Tasha's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. Her lips moved, but only faint, fragmented sounds emerged.
I'm sorry,
She mouthed, her breath hitching in shallow gasps. Behind her, Dante stood frozen, his face ashen. His lips moved, but no sound came. His gaze darted between Naomi and Tasha, his hands twitching at his sides. Fear and guilt twisted his features, but he didn't move to help.
Dante!
Naomi screamed, her voice raw.
Call 911! Do something!
His breath hitched, and he fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. Naomi's focus returned to Tasha, her sobs breaking through her words.
You're going to be okay. Help is coming.
The sound of distant sirens broke through the storm outside, growing louder with each passing second. Naomi's hands pressed harder against the wound, her palms slick with blood that refused to stop flowing. Tasha's body convulsed weakly, her breaths growing more ragged.
Don't give up on me.
Naomi whispered, tears streaming down her face.
You hear me? Don't you dare give up.
Tasha's lips parted again, a weak, trembling whisper escaping.
Naomi.
Her voice faded as her eyes closed. Naomi let out a guttural cry, her entire body shaking. The door burst open, and officers spilled into the room, their boots splashing in the puddles forming on the linoleum. The scene was chaos, officers shouting commands, medics rushing to Tasha's side, and Naomi's sobs cutting through it all. Naomi's hands were pulled away as medics worked to stabilize Tasha. One officer gently but firmly guided Naomi to her feet, snapping cuffs onto her wrists. Her gaze never left Tasha as she was led out of the room, the storm inside her as unrelenting as the one outside. The investigation begins. Boots splashed through crimson puddles as Officer Daniels stepped into the motel room, his gun drawn. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of fear. His sharp eyes scanned the chaos. Medics huddled over Tasha, their voices a blur of urgency, while another officer gently escorted Naomi out of the room, her hands cuffed behind her back. Daniel's gaze landed on the discarded gun, glinting under the fluorescent lights. He motioned for an evidence bag, his expression grim. "Secure the weapon," he ordered, his tone clipped. Naomi's cries echoed down the hallway, muffled but raw.
She's alive. Please, don't let her die.
Her voice cracked, the desperation cutting through the procedural buzz of the scene. Daniels exchanged a glance with another officer, his jaw tightening. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. "Let's move," he muttered, stepping aside as the medics rushed past him with Tasha on a stretcher. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but she was still alive, for now. Outside, Naomi was being loaded into the back of a squad car. Her tear-streaked face turned toward Tasha as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Her lips moved silently, a prayer or a plea that no one could hear. Daniels followed her gaze, his features softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again. He turned to the officer beside him. "Get statements from the witnesses," he ordered, "and make sure that gun goes straight to ballistics." Inside the squad car, Naomi's hands trembled in her lap, her wrists raw against the cuffs. Her mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her, each rumble of thunder a cruel reminder of the gunshot that had changed everything. Daniels watched as the squad car pulled away, the rain washing over its roof in relentless streams. He glanced at the bloodied motel room one last time, his gut telling him that this case was only beginning. Ending. In the ICU, Tasha lay motionless, a ventilator hissing softly beside her. The faint glow of the machines illuminated her bandaged chest and pale skin. The heart monitor's rhythm faltered, each beat more uncertain than the last. The surgeon's brow furrowed in fierce concentration, his movements precise and deliberate. "Push another unit," he ordered, his tone calm but urgent. He glanced at the monitor, willing the numbers to stabilize. Meanwhile, back at the Flint Police Department, Naomi sat in a cold interrogation room. Her wrists were cuffed to the table, and her eyes stared blankly at the one-way mirror. Detective Joel Anders watched her from behind the glass, his expression impassive, though his fingers tapped anxiously on the folder in his hands. Naomi's silence gnawed at him. He stepped into the room, placing the folder down with deliberate care. Without a word, he opened it and slid a photograph across the table. It was of Tasha at the motel, her sweater soaked in blood, her face contorted in pain. Naomi flinched, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "She's still alive," Anders said, his tone steady but probing. "But just barely. You know what that means, don't you? If she doesn't make it, this becomes a whole different conversation." Naomi's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind was still at the motel, replaying the moment over and over. She could still hear the gunshot, still see Tasha's wide, tear-filled eyes. Anders leaned forward. "Why did you pull the trigger?" he pressed, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Was it anger? Fear? Or were you trying to protect someone?" Naomi's tear-filled gaze met his. Her voice, hoarse and trembling, broke the silence.
Because I thought it was the only way to stop the pain.
Back in the ICU, the monitor let out a sharp beep, jolting the room as Tasha's vitals dipped dangerously low. Doctors rushed in, their voices urgent as the line between life and death blurred once again. The surgeon's jaw tightened. "Come on," he whispered, his gloved hands moving faster. "Don't give up on me now." Lines in the sand. "Caldwell!" The sharp bark of the captain's voice startled Dante, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. His badge slammed onto the desk, the sharp sound cutting through the tense silence. The captain's piercing gaze bore into him as he sat down heavily. "You've dragged this badge through the mud, Caldwell," he said, his voice a low growl. "It'll take more than an 8% pay cut and a demotion to patrolman to clean up this mess. You've got a lot to prove if you want to stay in this department." Dante's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Anger flickered briefly in his eyes, but it quickly gave way to shame.
Yes, sir.
He muttered, his voice barely audible. "What was that?" the captain snapped. "You're lucky you still have a job, Caldwell. Don't make me regret keeping you on. You've done enough damage to your family and this department." The words hit Dante like a blow. He nodded stiffly, his throat tight. As he left the office, the echoes of his choices followed him like a shadow, heavier with each step. Outside, he leaned against the hallway wall, his chest heaving. For the first time since the motel, tears burned in his eyes. He had thought he could control everything, but now, everything was slipping through his fingers. Across town, Naomi sat in her cell, her hands trembling as she gripped a small photograph of her family. Her mind raced with thoughts of rebuilding, of piecing together the fragments of what was left. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, all you can do is start over." She didn't know where to begin, but she knew she had to try. Both Dante and Naomi, worlds apart yet tied by the same storm, sat in silence, their thoughts consumed by regret, guilt, and the faint hope of redemption. A month had passed since the motel shooting. The weight of that night lingered heavily over everyone involved, but none more so than Tasha. The once lively teacher now sat in a wheelchair, her face pale and drawn. Paralyzed from the waist down, she had been discharged from the hospital just days ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the armrests of her chair, her gaze fixed on the window of her small apartment. The world outside moved on, oblivious to her new reality. Naomi's cries still haunted Tasha. She could hear them in the silence of the night, feel them echoing in the aching void of her own guilt. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the knowledge of how far things had spiraled out of control. A sharp knock on the door broke her reverie. Her mother entered, carrying a tray with tea and toast. "You need to eat," she said gently, placing the tray on the table beside her. Tasha nodded absently, her fingers brushing against the edges of the wheelchair. 5 months later, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial began. Naomi sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her lawyer, an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, leaned in to whisper something, but Naomi barely registered it. Her gaze was fixed on Tasha, seated across the room in her wheelchair, flanked by her parents. The prosecutor stood, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal, rage, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions." He gestured toward Tasha. Ms. Tasha Caldwell is a victim in every sense of the word. Paralyzed, her life forever altered because of a single act of violence. Naomi's breath hitched. She stared down at her lap, her lawyer's hand briefly touching her shoulder in reassurance. When Tasha took the stand, her voice was steady, but the emotion in her words was palpable.
I love Naomi. She was like a sister to me. But that night, everything changed.
Her eyes flickered toward Naomi, then back to the jury.
I don't hate her. I hate what happened. I hate what we became.
The defense presented a different narrative. Naomi's lawyer painted a picture of a woman pushed to her breaking point. "She's not a monster," the lawyer argued. "She's a human being who acted out of pain and betrayal." In her testimony, Naomi's voice cracked with emotion.
I never wanted to hurt anyone.
She said, her eyes brimming with tears.
I didn't know how to stop the pain.
The trial stretched on, every detail scrutinized. The jury deliberated for hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of aggravated assault. Naomi was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Naomi turned to Tasha. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither said anything. Then Tasha gave the faintest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. The storm that had torn their lives apart had passed, but the scars it left behind would remain forever. Threads of redemption. 3 years later, the sun rose over Flint, casting a golden glow on the quiet streets. Naomi stood outside the gates of the Women's Correctional Facility, clutching her release papers. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Freedom tasted bittersweet. Her time in prison had been transformative. She thought back to the quiet nights in her cell, journaling under the dim glow of the overhead light. Each word she wrote had felt like a step toward understanding, forgiveness perhaps, or just clarity. One memory stood out. An older inmate, Gwen, had once told her, "You've got to carry your scars, girl. They're yours, but they don't have to define you." That advice had anchored her in the darkest moments. Tasha's journey had been different, but no less significant. The scars from that night had lingered, but she'd found solace in her work. Returning to the classroom had been daunting, but her students had given her purpose. On the anniversary of the shooting, she wrote Naomi a letter.
I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you know I'm trying to be better. Thank you for waking me up, even if it was the hardest way possible.
Dante's life had unraveled after Naomi's arrest. Demoted to patrolman and ostracized by colleagues, he'd spent years in quiet self-reflection. Redemption had come slowly, starting with volunteer work at a youth mentorship program. One evening, as he spoke to a room of at-risk teens, he said,
Mistakes don't define you. What you do after does.
The words felt like an apology, even if no one else knew who they were truly meant for. Naomi walked to a nearby park, her steps unsteady but purposeful. She sat on a bench, the release papers folded neatly in her lap. Pulling out a notebook, she began to write. Each word felt like a stitch, mending the frayed edges of her life. She thought of Tasha, of Dante, and of herself. 3 lives forever changed, yet still moving forward. As the sun climbed higher, Naomi looked up from her notebook, her resolve steady. The past was a heavy burden, but the future was hers to shape.